An elderly woman heard a noise in the yard and thought something bad had happened. She braced herself for the worst, but when she went out onto the porch and saw what 4 boys were doing, she couldn't hold back her tears. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching this video from. The summer sun had already risen high above the trees, casting its pale gold across the slanted roof of the old house where Martha lived. She sat at her small kitchen table, a chipped porcelain cup of tea trembling faintly in her hands, and stared at the window as if it were a screen upon which her whole life played out. Beyond the dusty glass, the yard stretched wide and wild. Grass, once neatly trimmed when her husband had been alive, now grew in uneven waves that swayed whenever the slightest breeze passed. Weeds had curled their stubborn stalks around the rotting wooden fence, and what had once been flower beds bloomed now only with nettles and dandelions. To most, it would look like a forgotten place. To her, it was the last remnant of a life that had meant something. Martha had once been proud of this home. When she and Henry, her late husband, had first moved here, the house had been in no better shape than it was now, but back then they had youth and hope and laughter to fill its cracks. She could remember how Henry would spend long days building the porch by hand, hammering nails one by one, whistling songs he had learned as a boy. She would be out in the yard, pulling weeds or planting roses, occasionally calling out to him, and he would wipe his brow and smile. Those were days of companionship and a quiet sense of victory in small things. But Henry had been gone for 10 long years, and every board he had hammered into place seemed to creak now under the weight of time and neglect. Her children had grown and left. They lived in faraway cities, too busy with their jobs, their families, their modern lives. They still called sometimes, though the calls had grown shorter and less frequent. They promised to visit, but visits never came. Martha told herself she did not want to bother them. They had their own responsibilities, their own struggles. She had always been proud and independent, the kind of woman who worked in the fields beside her husband, who never once complained even in the hardest winters. But age had a way of wearing down pride until it was replaced by silence and the painful acceptance of limits. She was nearly 80 now, her bones brittle, her knees aching every time she took a step. Even walking across the room sometimes left her breathless. The mornings were the hardest. She would wake to silence, a silence so deep that it pressed against her chest. No clatter of breakfast plates, no hum of Henry's radio, no distant sound of children running in the yard. Only the ticking of the clock above the stove, a slow reminder of time marching forward whether she wanted it to or not. She would rise carefully, her joints stiff, and shuffle to the kitchen to make tea. The house felt too large for her small movements, as though it had been built for lives that had long since gone, leaving only her shadow to drift from room to room. It was not only her body that betrayed her. Her spirit had grown weary too. Sometimes she would sit on the edge of her bed and wonder what purpose her days still held. She had once been needed, by her husband, by her children, by the community that knew her as a woman who would always lend a hand. Now, the phone rarely rang. The mailbox was filled with advertisements or bills, and the only knock she expected at the door was from the delivery man bringing groceries once a week. She told herself she was content, but deep down, she felt invisible. The world moved fast around her, but it no longer asked her to take part. Outside her window, the world seemed determined to remind her of her frailty. The yard, once a symbol of their hard work, had grown wild. The fence leaned as if it might collapse with the next storm. The grass climbed higher each day, and the weeds stretched proudly into the sky. She wished she could do something about it. There was a time when she would rise with the sun, put on her gardening gloves, and lose herself in the soil until dusk. Now she could barely carry a watering can without her hands trembling. The sight of the overgrown yard filled her with shame, as though it broadcast to anyone who passed by that she was no longer capable of caring for her own home. She often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun sink low and paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. These were the quiet hours when memories came strongest. She remembered Henry sitting beside her, their fingers entwined as they spoke about the future. She remembered the children playing tag in the grass, their laughter filling the air like birdsong. She remembered the neighborhood barbecues, the times when friends and family crowded the yard with chatter and music. Those days felt like another lifetime. Now the porch creaked beneath only her, and the silence stretched on until the crickets began their nightly song. Her health was not what it once was. The doctor had told her she needed to rest more, to take her medications faithfully, to avoid overexerting herself. But what did it mean to rest when every day was already an endless stretch of stillness? She did not fear death so much as she feared fading away unnoticed, becoming just another elderly woman in a forgotten house on a forgotten street. Sometimes at night, she would wake and lie staring at the ceiling, listening to the loneliness that seemed to echo through the walls. She missed the simple comfort of another presence, the sound of breathing beside her, the warmth of a hand in the dark. Yet, despite the heaviness, Martha still carried a quiet dignity. She dressed herself each morning, carefully buttoning her faded dresses, combing her silver hair, and applying a touch of powder to her cheeks. She told herself she did it not because anyone would see her, but because she deserved it. She had always been taught to take pride in who she was, even when the world looked away. It was this small ritual of self-respect that kept her from unraveling completely. Still, the weight of loneliness pressed on her shoulders like an invisible burden, and each day seemed harder than the last. The seasons turned, but for Martha the days blurred into one another. Winter brought cold drafts that seeped through the cracks in the walls, and she would sit huddled in a blanket, watching frost creep along the windows. Spring brought rain that leaked through the roof and dripped into bowls she had to place across the floor. Summer now pressed hot air into the house, the kind of heat that clung to the skin and left her exhausted. She often wondered how many more summers she would see. Sometimes she prayed for strength, sometimes for peace, and sometimes only for someone to remember she was still here. She did not yet know that the world beyond her quiet house was about to intrude in ways she could not have imagined. For now, she sat at her table with her cooling tea, gazing out at the wild grass and the swaying weeds, feeling both shame and sorrow. The yard seemed like a mirror of her own life, untended, overlooked, and slowly consumed by time. She sighed, set the cup down, and closed her eyes, wishing that Henry were there to tell her what to do. She did not know that soon enough a letter would arrive that would push her deeper into fear, forcing her to confront not only the state of her home, but the state of her own fading strength. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, tucked in the rusted metal box at the end of her driveway. Martha had not expected anything of consequence. Most of the time, the mail consisted of discount flyers or bills she dreaded opening. She shuffled down the driveway with slow, deliberate steps, clutching her cane in one hand and the mailbox key in the other. The heat pressed against her shoulders, and she thought briefly of turning back without checking, but habit pulled her onward. When she finally opened the box and withdrew the small stack of envelopes, one of them stood out. It was heavier than the rest, stamped with the insignia of the city. The official look of it sent a strange unease crawling through her chest. She carried it inside, placed the others aside, and sat at the kitchen table. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the papers. The words were printed in stern black ink, full of phrases that seemed distant and cold. Non-compliance with city ordinance, property maintenance violation, mandatory appearance in court. At first, she did not understand what any of it meant. She read the lines again and again, her lips moving softly until the meaning fell on her like a hammer. The city had decided her yard was in violation of local law. The grass was too tall, the weeds uncontrolled. If she did not appear before a judge, there would be consequences. Fines. Possible legal action. Her breath caught in her throat. She had heard of such things happening in other neighborhoods, but never imagined that she would be targeted. She had lived in this house for more than 50 years, paid her taxes, kept to herself. No one had ever complained to her face. To think that the height of grass could become the measure of her life and worth seemed absurd, yet here it was in black and white. The letter did not ask if she was capable, if her body still allowed her to push a mower. It did not ask if she had family to help. It only declared what she had failed to do and what punishment would follow. For a long time she sat motionless, staring at the page. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. Outside, the sound of cicadas filled the air, relentless in their chorus. Martha felt the heat rise to her face, not from the weather but from shame. The thought of standing in a courtroom, of being treated like a careless criminal, twisted her stomach. She imagined neighbors whispering, imagined headlines in the local paper. Elderly woman violates city code. She could not bear it. She thought of calling her children. Perhaps one of them might come, though she knew their lives were full and distant. The last time she had asked her eldest son for help, he had sighed heavily and told her he was overwhelmed with work. She had never forgotten the weariness in his voice. To burden him again felt impossible. Her daughter lived even farther away, her time divided between her job and her own family. Martha had always told herself she would not be the kind of parent who clung to her children, demanding attention. She had prided herself on her strength. Now that pride felt like a chain around her neck, heavy and unyielding. She considered hiring someone, a lawn service perhaps, but when she opened her purse and counted the crumpled bills inside, reality settled over her. Her monthly check barely covered utilities and groceries. Medicine had grown more expensive in the past year. To spend money on mowing grass seemed laughable when she sometimes skipped meals to make her prescriptions last. No, she could not afford help. The yard itself seemed to mock her. Through the window, she saw the tall grass bending in the sunlight, the weeds stretching toward the sky as if triumphant. Once, that yard had been her pride. She remembered Henry pushing the mower in long, steady rows, the smell of fresh clippings rising like perfume. She remembered setting chairs out in the evening, neighbors stopping by to sit and chat. Now the same ground stood as evidence against her, proof of her weakness. It was as though the earth itself had conspired with time to betray her. Fear seeped into her bones. She imagined the day she would have to step into a courthouse, strangers judging her, papers filed against her name. She had never been in trouble with the law, not once in her life. The thought of being summoned like a criminal filled her with dread. She could not understand why no one had spoken to her first, why no neighbor had knocked to say, "Martha, the grass is getting high." Instead, they had sent police and officials, cold letters and threats. As she sat there, the weight of her age pressed down harder. Her hands, once strong enough to knead dough, scrub floors, and lift children, now trembled with every movement. Her legs ached when she stood, her back bowed under years of labor. The idea of pushing a mower across the yard was laughable, and yet the law did not bend for aching knees or lonely widows. The clock ticked slowly, each sound like a reminder that time was running out. She folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and set it on the table. For a moment, she closed her eyes and whispered her husband's name, wishing for his steady voice, his reassurance. If Henry were here, he would have known what to do. He would have found a way. But Henry was gone, and all that remained was the fragile shell of the life they had built together. That night, she could not sleep. The letter lay on the table in the next room, but she felt its presence as if it were a weight pressing on her chest. She turned from side to side, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The fear of losing her home crept into her thoughts. If she could not meet the demands of the law, what would become of her? Would she be forced out, left to wander between the homes of children who had their own burdens? Would she end her days not in the house she had cherished, but in some cold room where no one knew her name? The next morning, she rose with heavy limbs and sat again at the table. The paper stared back at her, unyielding. She read it once more, though the words no longer changed. The violation was clear. The expectation was clear. But the path forward was lost to her. The world she had known, where neighbors looked after one another and respect was earned by years of honest work, seemed to have slipped away. In its place was a world of ordinances and fines where human frailty held no sway. She felt as though she were being swallowed by it, as though her voice no longer mattered. The silence of her house seemed deeper than ever. Still, beneath the fear, a flicker of determination stirred. Martha had survived too much in her life to surrender easily. She told herself she would find a way. Perhaps she would write to the city, explain her situation. Perhaps someone would listen. The thought gave her a thin thread of hope, though it was fragile, easily broken by the shadows of doubt. She leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. The day stretched before her, hot and unforgiving. Outside, the grass swayed, indifferent to her struggle. She watched it for a long time, her eyes narrowing as though she could will it to stop growing. But it did not stop. It never would. Martha did not yet know that this letter, this single piece of paper, was only the beginning of her trials. She did not know how quickly the weight of the law would descend upon her life, nor how powerless she would feel in its grasp. For now, she only knew that her world had shifted, that the safety she had once felt in her small, quiet home had been pierced by the cold hand of authority. She gathered the letter once more, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer beside her chair, as though hiding it might delay the storm it promised. But storms do not wait for permission, and hers was already on its way. The letter had not left her thoughts. Even after she slid it into the drawer beside her chair, it seemed to radiate through the wood, reminding her of its presence every moment she sat in the room. The words it contained circled endlessly in her mind, sharp and unyielding, as though the city itself whispered them into her ears with each breath. Martha could not eat with peace. She could not sleep soundly, and she could not look at her yard without feeling a twisting knot of dread in her chest. The grass that swayed outside her window no longer seemed like simple overgrowth. It had become an accusation, a symbol of her failure, a declaration to the world that she was no longer capable of caring for her own life. One morning, after a restless night of broken sleep, she resolved to do something about it. She could not stand idly by, waiting for the court date to arrive and the law to decide her fate. She was not ready to give up her home, the last remnant of the life she had built with Henry. She had always been a woman of action, never content to sit and let the world pass her by. So she tied an old scarf around her head to shield her from the sun, pulled on her garden gloves, worn thin with age but still intact, and stepped outside into the heat. The air was heavy, pressing against her skin as she moved across the porch and into the grass that brushed against her knees. She carried with her the only tool she still had strength to lift, a pair of rusty shears and a small hand rake. They were pitiful compared to the task ahead, but they were all she could manage. She bent down and began to cut, snipping at the thick stalks of weeds one by one. Each movement sent a sharp ache through her back, but she clenched her jaw and pressed on. At first, there was a strange relief in the work. She could feel the rhythm of it, the way her hands moved in a pattern she remembered from years past. For a fleeting moment, she felt almost like herself again, a younger version with energy and strength. But the illusion did not last. After only a few minutes, her hands began to tremble and sweat poured down her face. The sun seemed to grow hotter, the grass thicker, the weeds more stubborn. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her knees threatened to buckle beneath her. She dropped the shears into the dirt and sat heavily on the ground, her chest rising and falling in uneven waves. She looked around at the vast yard, the endless green stretching in every direction, and despair washed over her. The small patch she had managed to cut was almost invisible compared to the rest. It was as though she had done nothing at all. The weeds mocked her from every corner, tall and defiant. She pressed her hands into the soil and wept quietly, the sound lost in the buzzing of cicadas. She had always been strong. She had always managed, no matter the hardship. But now her body betrayed her, and she felt humiliated by her own weakness. When she finally struggled to her feet, every joint screamed in protest. She limped back to the porch, leaving the shears behind as if they were relics of a battle she had already lost. She sank into the rocking chair and closed her eyes, her breath ragged, her spirit broken. The law demanded that she maintain her yard, but her body made it impossible. She was trapped between two unyielding forces, and there was no path she could see that would free her. As the days passed, the fear grew heavier. She imagined the knock on her door, officers standing with stern faces, ready to take her away because of the grass. She imagined neighbors whispering, pitying her, shaking their heads at the sight of her shame. She imagined losing the house, being sent away to live in some cold place where no one knew her name. Each thought dug deeper into her heart, leaving her restless and anxious. At night, she would lie awake, listening to the creaks of the old house and the distant howl of dogs, her mind painting pictures of the worst to come. Sometimes she thought of reaching out for help, but the thought crumbled before it could become action. She pictured calling her son, explaining her plight, but she could already hear his sigh on the other end of the line, the pause before he told her how busy he was. She pictured her daughter's polite but distracted voice, offering sympathy but little else. She told herself she could not burden them, not when they had families of their own. Better to suffer in silence than to hear the disappointment in their words. Her neighbors might have helped once, years ago when the community was different, when people still looked out for one another, but those days seemed gone. The new families were strangers to her, polite enough when they passed but distant, their lives moving too quickly to notice the frail woman at the end of the street. She could not bring herself to knock on their doors, to expose her weakness to them. Pride and shame tangled together in her chest, making it impossible to ask for help. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch watching the overgrown yard sway in the breeze, a thought entered her mind that frightened her. What if she simply let it all go? What if she allowed the grass to grow, the house to crumble, the law to do as it pleased? Perhaps she was too tired to fight anymore. Perhaps it would be easier to surrender. The thought lingered, dark and tempting, but deep inside she knew she could not bear it. This house was not just wood and nails. It was her life, her memories, the last piece of her family. To give it up without a fight would be to give up herself entirely. Still, despair lingered like a shadow. Each day she grew weaker, her hope thinner, her fear heavier. The letter remained in the drawer, waiting like a silent judge. The yard continued its wild march toward chaos, each blade of grass a reminder of her failure. She felt caught in a storm she could not outrun, and the loneliness of it pressed against her chest until it was hard to breathe. Martha sat by the window late one evening, the sun setting in streaks of red and gold, and whispered to the empty room. She asked Henry what she should do, though she knew no answer would come. She pressed her hand against the glass and closed her eyes, listening to the world beyond her house. Somewhere in the distance, children laughed, free and unburdened, their voices rising like a promise of life she could no longer touch. She felt old and small and forgotten. Yet she did not know that change was drawing nearer, carried on the very voices that drifted through the summer air. She did not know that soon the silence of her lonely days would be broken, not by the knock of the law, but by unexpected sounds in her yard, sounds that would terrify her at first, then alter the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. For now, though, she remained at the window, staring into the twilight, despair heavy on her shoulders and fear lodged firmly in her heart. The nights grew heavier after her failed attempts to tame the grass. Martha's body still ached from that single afternoon when she tried to cut it down with her old shears, and her spirit ached even more. She felt as though her effort had been a cruel reminder from life itself, a demonstration that she was no longer who she once had been. Each evening she sat at her window as the light faded from the sky, listening to the quiet of her empty house. Silence had become her most persistent companion, but now even silence seemed sharp, like something that cut into her with every hour she spent alone. The letter still sat folded in the drawer, untouched but not forgotten, and every time she glanced at that drawer she felt the weight of it settle deeper inside her chest. On one such evening, the air hung heavy and hot. The windows were open to let in the slightest breeze, but the air that moved through the house was thick and warm, doing nothing to ease her discomfort. She had placed a damp cloth against the back of her neck, a habit she had learned from her mother long ago when summers in the South grew unbearable. The cicadas droned in the distance, their rhythm unbroken, and she tried to focus on that sound to quiet the restlessness in her mind. Yet, beneath their song, she began to notice something else, faint at first, like a distant tapping. Her brow furrowed as she leaned closer to the window, straining to hear. The sound came again, clearer now, a clatter, irregular but insistent, followed by what might have been a muffled laugh. Martha straightened in her chair, her pulse quickening. She told herself it was nothing, perhaps a branch falling, perhaps an animal moving through the weeds. But then the sound came once more, louder this time, a metallic clink, like tools striking against one another, and beneath it, unmistakable voices. She froze. Voices meant people, and people in her yard at dusk could mean trouble. Her mind leapt to every story she had read in the local paper about intrusions and robberies, about the way elderly homeowners were often seen as easy targets. She remembered the warnings from the news, the frightening tales of strangers knocking on doors only to force their way inside. Her hands grew clammy as she reached instinctively for her cane, holding it tight in her lap as though it might serve as a weapon if she needed it. The voices grew clearer now, young and high-pitched, the cadence of boys who were not yet men. She caught fragments of their words carried on the humid air, bursts of laughter, playful teasing, the kind of tone she had not heard since her own children were young. Yet, instead of reassuring her, the sounds unsettled her even more. Why would children come onto her property at this hour? What business could they have here? The thought of mischief crossed her mind. Perhaps they had come to vandalize, to taunt the old woman at the end of the street whose yard was a jungle. Perhaps they thought of her as nothing more than a joke. Martha's chest tightened as she rose carefully from her chair. Her knees protested, and her steps were slow, but determination carried her toward the front of the house. She stopped by the window, parting the curtain just enough to peer outside. At first, all she could see was the tall grass bending in the evening light. But then, at the edge of her property near the fence, she saw them. 4 figures moving through the yard, their shapes small but energetic, their heads bobbing as they walked. One carried what looked like a long tool slung over his shoulder. Another dragged a bag behind him, its contents clinking with each step. A chill ran through her body. Her breath came faster now, shallow and quick. The image stirred every fear she had tried to bury in the last few weeks. She thought of how vulnerable she was, a frail woman alone in a crumbling house, without family nearby, without strength in her arms. If those boys meant harm, there would be nothing she could do. For the first time in years, she wished desperately that Henry were alive, that his tall frame and firm voice could stand beside her, shielding her from whatever danger lurked outside. The boys moved closer, their laughter rising, and Martha stepped back from the window, pressing her back against the wall. Her mind raced through possibilities. Should she call the police? Her phone was on the table in the other room, and for a moment she pictured herself dialing frantically, trying to explain to a dispatcher that children were in her yard. But another thought struck her. What if the police arrived and blamed her instead, the woman already in trouble with the law? What if they dismissed her fears, or worse, used the visit as another chance to hand her more papers and threats? The very idea of speaking to them again made her stomach twist. She clenched her cane tighter and shuffled toward the door. If she had to, she would stand on her porch and face them. Her heart pounded with every step, and she felt a shiver move down her spine, though the heat was still thick around her. She reached for the doorknob, but paused, her ear catching another sound. Not just laughter now, but the unmistakable whir of metal, the faint sputter of a motor trying to start. It was so out of place in her overgrown yard that she hesitated, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. Then it came again, louder, unmistakable, the sound of a lawnmower. Her fear did not ease, not at first. The mower could mean anything. Perhaps they had stolen it. Perhaps they intended to destroy what little remained of her yard as some cruel joke. She pressed her forehead against the door frame, fighting to steady her breath. Yet a part of her, small and reluctant, wondered if there could be another explanation. The idea flickered faintly in her mind, though she did not dare believe it. The voices grew closer, the laughter mingling with the engine's hum. She opened the door just a crack, just enough to let her eyes peer out into the fading light. There they were, 4 boys no older than 15, moving about her yard with the careless energy of youth. 2 of them carried tools, rakes, clippers, while the other 2 pushed the mower across the tangled grass. She blinked in disbelief, certain at first that her eyes deceived her. But the scene did not change. The boys were working, not destroying. They were cutting down the very weeds that had stood as her torment for weeks. Her grip on the cane loosened as confusion overtook her fear. She could not understand it. Strangers had entered her property without warning, yet instead of harm, they seemed intent on helping. She stepped back from the door, unsure what to do, her heart still racing. Should she confront them? Should she demand to know why they were here? Or should she simply let them be, uncertain whether this miracle would last? For several minutes she stood frozen, torn between suspicion and wonder. Her body trembled and her thoughts spun wildly. The sound of the mower filled her ears, a noise she had once known so well when Henry worked the yard each weekend. It was a sound that spoke of care, of life maintained. Now it came from the hands of strangers, uninvited yet strangely welcome. As twilight deepened, Martha returned slowly to her chair by the window. She sat and watched through the glass, her eyes wide, her breath uneven. The boys moved with purpose, laughing and calling to one another as they worked. The fear that had first seized her heart did not vanish entirely, but something else began to stir alongside it, something she had not felt in a long time, a fragile thread of hope. She did not yet understand who they were or why they had come, but for the first time since the letter arrived, she no longer felt entirely alone. Still, doubt clung to her like a shadow. She whispered Henry's name again, almost as though asking him whether to trust this strange turn of events. The house answered only with silence. Outside, the boys worked on, their youthful energy spilling into the darkening evening, and Martha could only watch, caught between fear and the first tremors of wonder. She could not have known then how deeply this moment would change her, nor how the presence of 4 boys in her neglected yard would become the turning point of her despair. For now, she sat at the window with trembling hands, the sounds of their labor filling the air, and waited for whatever would come next. Martha remained by the window long after the mower's sputtering had begun to settle into a steady hum. The longer she watched, the more her heart wrestled with conflicting emotions. Fear still lingered, born of the shock of seeing strangers in her yard without warning. Suspicion clung to her as well, whispering that perhaps there was some hidden trick, some cruel intention she had yet to see. But those feelings began to falter as her eyes followed the movements of the boys, the way they bent their backs to the task with an energy that was unmistakably earnest. They were working, not playing at mischief. The mower carved a visible path through the tall grass, leaving behind neat rows of short green that Martha had not glimpsed in months. She pressed her hand to the glass and felt tears prick at her eyes. She did not want to cry. Not now. Not when she still did not know who these boys were or why they had come. Yet the sight of them filled her with something so unfamiliar she could barely name it. Gratitude, perhaps, but mingled with disbelief, with the ache of knowing how long it had been since anyone had stepped forward to ease her burdens. She blinked rapidly, unwilling to let the tears fall, and kept her gaze steady on the yard. The boys moved as though they had done this many times before. Two raked clippings into piles while another swung clippers at the weeds clinging to her fence. The youngest of them, no more than 12 or 13, followed behind with determination, gathering stray branches and stuffing them into a bag. Their laughter rang out, light and unrestrained, but it carried no malice. It was the laughter of children at work together, a shared joy and simple effort. Martha listened, her ears straining as if to absorb every note. The sound carried her back to years long gone, when her own children's voices had echoed through the same yard on long summer evenings. Still, she hesitated. Part of her urged her to step outside, to ask them why they were here, to demand answers. Another part of her, quieter but stronger, told her to remain where she was and simply allow the miracle to unfold. She had been so desperate for help, yet when it arrived unannounced, she found herself almost afraid to touch it, as though any sudden move might break the spell. And so she sat, clutching her cane in her lap, her eyes fixed on the window, and watched as the impossible took shape before her. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the transformation of her yard became undeniable. The mower pushed steadily across ground that had once seemed unconquerable, each pass widening the space of order against the chaos. The weeds that had towered against her fence fell in clusters under the sharp snap of clippers. The piles of grass grew higher, proof of labor done without expectation of reward. Martha's mouth trembled as she whispered words of thanks, though no one could hear her. Her mind, weary from weeks of despair, struggled to comprehend what she saw. Why would strangers choose her yard of all places? They had not knocked on her door, had not asked permission. They had simply come, armed with tools, and begun to work. She thought again of the letter hidden in her drawer, the violation that hung over her like a sentence. Could it be that they knew of her trouble? Could it be that someone in the community had seen her plight and sent these children to her aid? The thought seemed too generous to believe, and yet, as she watched them sweat and laugh beneath the fading sun, she could not deny that their actions carried the weight of kindness. A memory surfaced unbidden of Henry returning from work on a summer afternoon, his shirt damp with sweat and his smile weary but warm. He would sit on the porch with a glass of water, and the children would tumble into his lap, proud of the small chores they had completed. Martha had always told them that helping others was the measure of a good person, that labor given freely was worth more than any coin. To see those same lessons alive now, in the hands of children she did not even know, made her chest tighten with something close to joy. The sun slipped lower, painting the yard in a soft golden light. Martha finally rose from her chair, her legs unsteady, and moved to the door. She opened it slowly, the hinges creaking, and stepped onto the porch. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, sharp and sweet, a perfume she had almost forgotten. For a moment, she simply breathed it in, letting it wash through her, filling her with the memory of better times. The boys noticed her then, pausing in their work to glance toward the porch. One of them lifted a hand in a quick wave, then bent again to his task as though nothing more needed to be said. Her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to thank them, to call out, to let them know how much this meant to her, but the lump in her throat silenced her. She leaned heavily on her cane, her heart swelling as she watched them continue. It was enough, she decided, simply to witness this act of grace. Perhaps later she would find the words. For now, she would let her tears fall silently, hidden in the lines of her face, and allow the gift to unfold without interruption. The yard that had seemed her enemy for so long now changed before her eyes into something familiar once more. She could see the outlines of her garden, the neat rows of grass, the fence standing taller without the weight of weeds. It was as if her home itself were breathing again, freed from suffocation. She felt a flicker of hope stir inside her, fragile but real. For weeks she had lived beneath a cloud of fear and despair, convinced that no one cared, that she was alone against the weight of the law and the failing of her own body. But now, here, 4 boys had arrived like a force of nature, unexpected and unasked for, and given her a reprieve she had thought impossible. Martha sank back into her rocking chair as the boys worked on, her hands folded in her lap. She watched them until the shadows grew long and the mower's engine finally sputtered into silence. The yard lay transformed, not perfect but alive again, proof that kindness could carve through despair as surely as the blades had carved through the grass. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of their laughter linger in her ears, and whispered a prayer of thanks to the empty air. She did not yet know their names, nor why they had come. She did not know if they would return tomorrow or vanish back into their own lives. But she knew one thing with certainty. Her burden had been lifted, if only for a while, and the loneliness that had weighed so heavily upon her heart no longer seemed as absolute. In its place, a new feeling had begun to take root, delicate and trembling like a seed pushing through soil. It was the feeling that perhaps she had not been forgotten after all. And as the evening light dimmed and the boys gathered their tools, Martha felt a quiet shift within herself. The fear that had haunted her for so many nights loosened its grip. The despair that had chained her to her chair weakened. Something brighter stirred in its place, as though the laughter of children and the scent of cut grass had stitched her soul back together in ways she had not thought possible. She sat watching them go, her heart both heavy with gratitude and light with relief, and knew that her life had just turned a corner she could never have predicted. The scent of fresh grass lingered through the night and into the morning, filling Martha's house with a fragrance she had not known in far too long. She woke before the sun had fully risen, sitting up in bed and listening to the quiet hum of the early hours. For the first time in weeks, she did not dread the view from her window. She pushed herself to her feet, her body stiff but lighter somehow, and shuffled to the glass. What she saw brought fresh tears to her eyes. The yard, though not perfect, bore the clear mark of care. The long, wild grass had been humbled into neat patches, and the stubborn weeds were cut low against the fence. It was as though the land itself had sighed with relief. She pressed her hand against the window pane and whispered a silent blessing for the boys who had come like angels out of nowhere. Throughout the day, she found herself drifting toward the porch again and again, unable to stop marveling at the transformation. Each time she stepped outside, she half expected to see them still there, their laughter rising over the hum of the mower, their young hands working diligently. But the yard was empty now, quiet in the stillness of summer, and the memory of their presence felt like a dream. She wondered if they would ever return, or if they had been nothing more than a passing gift. By late afternoon, the sun burned hot against the land. Martha sat in her rocking chair, fanning herself with a folded newspaper, when she heard another sound that startled her from her thoughts. It was the creak of footsteps on gravel, the murmur of voices. She stiffened, her heart leaping in sudden alarm, but when she looked down the street she saw not boys this time, but her neighbors. A woman she recognized distantly, younger and tall, was approaching with 2 men beside her. Behind them trailed others carrying tools, rakes, clippers, even another mower. Their faces were flushed in the heat, but their expressions were warm, purposeful. Martha's breath caught. She gripped her cane and rose slowly, stepping to the edge of the porch as they came nearer. The woman lifted a hand in greeting and smiled. "We saw what those boys started yesterday," she called, her voice gentle but strong. "Thought we'd come lend a hand." For a moment, Martha could not find her words. She simply stood there, tears gathering once more in her eyes as her neighbors climbed onto her lawn without hesitation and began to work. One man started the mower, its roar breaking the stillness, while another swung clippers at the stubborn weeds that remained. The woman bent to gather the piles of cuttings into bags. More neighbors joined as the minutes passed, carrying water, hauling tools, offering cheerful words. The quiet street had transformed into a scene of bustling labor, all directed at her neglected yard. Martha lowered herself back into her chair, overwhelmed. She had lived on this street for decades, but in recent years she had felt more like a shadow than a neighbor. Families came and went, children grew, faces changed. She had convinced herself that no one noticed her anymore, that she had become invisible in the shuffle of modern life. And yet, here they were, unasked and unexpected, giving their time and their sweat to restore what she could not. The sight pierced her heart with both gratitude and sorrow, for she realized how deeply she had underestimated the kindness of those around her. The heat was oppressive, but no one seemed to mind. Shirts clung to damp backs, foreheads shone with sweat, but laughter rippled among them as they worked. The hum of machines and the scrape of rakes filled the air. Someone brought a cooler filled with ice and bottles of water, setting it beneath the shade of a tree. Another neighbor, an older woman Martha had seen at church years ago, appeared with a tray of lemonade and paper cups. The gathering was not organized, not planned, but it moved with the natural rhythm of community, each person stepping into place as though they had rehearsed it. Martha watched in silence, her hands trembling on her cane. She wanted to help, but her body would not allow it. She wanted to protest, to say they should not trouble themselves, but the words stuck in her throat. She realized then that sometimes the greatest act of courage was not in giving help, but in receiving it. She leaned back in her chair and let the tears fall freely, no longer ashamed. Her yard, once a wilderness that had brought her shame and fear, began to emerge again as something beautiful. The fence stood proud without the weight of vines and weeds. The grass lay even and soft, trimmed low. Flowers, she thought long smothered, peeked out from beneath the soil, freed at last from the choking growth that had hidden them. It was as if the land itself remembered what it once had been, grateful for the hands that had brought it back to life. Neighbors paused from time to time to wave at her, their smiles wide, their voices calling out encouragement. One of the younger men, his arms strong from labor, lifted a hand and said, "Almost done, Miss Martha. Won't be long now." She pressed her palm to her chest, overwhelmed by the sound of her own name spoken with such familiarity, and nodded, unable to speak. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the work continued. What had seemed like an impossible burden for her alone became light when shared among many. Tasks that would have taken her weeks, perhaps months, were completed in a single afternoon. By the time the mower fell silent and the last rake was set aside, her yard had been transformed. The once wild jungle now looked neat, welcoming, alive. It was more than she had hoped for, more than she had dared to dream. The neighbors gathered on the porch then, smiling and chatting as they handed her a glass of lemonade. Martha looked at each face in turn, seeing not strangers but companions. She realized that the loneliness she had carried for so long had blinded her to the truth. She had never been as alone as she thought. There were people around her who cared, people willing to step forward when she needed them most. She thanked them, her voice breaking, and they only smiled wider. "That's what neighbors are for," one woman said, patting her hand, and in that simple phrase lay a truth Martha had nearly forgotten. Community was not a relic of the past, not something lost with Henry or with the passing years. It was here still, alive in the hearts of those around her, waiting only for the chance to show itself. As evening fell and the neighbors drifted back to their homes, Martha remained on the porch, her glass empty, her heart full. She looked out over the yard, now smooth and clean beneath the fading light, and felt a peace she had not known in years. The fear that had haunted her since the letter first arrived seemed smaller now, diminished by the strength of the kindness she had witnessed. Whatever the law might demand, whatever the city might say, she knew she was not facing it alone anymore. For the first time in many long weeks, Martha smiled, a smile deep and genuine, born not of relief alone, but of rediscovered faith. Faith in her neighbors, faith in humanity, and perhaps even a small measure of faith in herself. The evening after the neighbors had gone, Martha remained on her porch long after the last sound of footsteps had faded down the street. The cicadas had resumed their relentless song, and the air had cooled slightly, carrying with it the faint perfume of cut grass and turned earth. She sat in her rocking chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap, and let her eyes wander over the yard that had been so utterly transformed in just a single day. It was no longer the wilderness of shame that had haunted her each time she looked out the window. The grass lay trimmed and soft, the fence stood free of choking weeds, and the flower beds whispered of colors that might soon return. For the first time in many weeks, she saw not neglect but promise. Sleep came easier that night, a deep and unbroken rest that wrapped around her like the embrace of a long-lost friend. She woke before dawn, and instead of the familiar dread that had greeted her mornings, there was something lighter in her chest. She moved carefully to the window, and in the pale light she saw her yard glistening with dew, each blade of grass bending beneath tiny diamonds of water. It looked new, reborn, as though the land itself had drawn strength from the hands that had cared for it. She whispered a quiet thank you, not only to the boys and neighbors who had done the work, but to God, to Henry, to the memory of every kindness she had ever known. Later that day she brewed a pitcher of tea, the old way she used to when Henry would come in from the fields, strong, sweet, and poured over ice. She set glasses out on a tray, added what cookies she had left in her tin, and carried it to the porch. She did not know if anyone would come, but she felt compelled to prepare as if they might. She wanted, at last, to give something back. To her quiet joy, the boys returned in the late afternoon, their faces flushed with the kind of eager pride only children can carry. They had come not to work this time, but simply to check on her, to see if she was well. She invited them onto the porch, and they accepted without hesitation, settling onto the steps and sipping the tea with grateful gulps. Martha watched them, her heart swelling as their laughter filled the air once more. She asked their names, Blaine, Thomas, Jeremy, and little Luke, and repeated each one as though memorizing a prayer. They told her they had seen the state of her yard and decided they could not let it stay that way. They wanted to do good, they said simply, to use their summer days for more than idleness. Their words were free of arrogance, spoken with the matter-of-fact sincerity of boys raised to believe kindness was an obligation, not a choice. Martha listened, and in their voices she heard echoes of her own past, of lessons she and Henry had tried to instill in their children long ago. She felt a pang of regret, a wondering if her children had forgotten those lessons as they drifted into their busy lives, but she let the thought go quickly, choosing instead to embrace the present moment, to see in these boys the living proof that goodness still grew in young hearts. She told them stories then, tales of her husband and the early years on the land, of the hardships they had faced and the joys they had shared. The boys leaned closer, listening with wide eyes, as though the past she spoke of was a treasure unearthed. The following days brought more visitors. Neighbors stopped by, some with small gifts, others simply to sit a while. A woman from down the street brought fresh bread. A man from 2 houses over offered to check her roof before the next storm. The change was astonishing to Martha, who had convinced herself she was invisible. Now she found herself at the center of quiet attention, her porch no longer a place of solitude but of gathering. She did not know what had shifted, whether the sight of the boys had reminded the community of something they had forgotten, or whether it was she herself who had changed, finally open to receiving what had always been around her. Whatever the reason, the result was undeniable. She was no longer alone. With each passing day, the fear that had weighed so heavily on her since the letter's arrival began to lift. The city still demanded its due, of course. She was still required to appear, to sign her name to papers that acknowledged the violation. But when she finally went to the courthouse, she did so not with the terror of a woman abandoned, but with the quiet strength of one who knew she had people at her side. Several of her neighbors even offered to accompany her, and though she declined, the offer alone was enough to steady her. She walked into that sterile building with her head held higher than she had thought possible. The matter was resolved more easily than she had feared. The judge listened, the papers were signed, and though the law would not bend, the weight of it no longer crushed her spirit. She left the courthouse into the blazing sunlight with a deep breath of relief. For so long she had imagined herself shackled by shame, but now she realized she carried within her a resilience that had not been broken. In the weeks that followed, the bonds formed through that single act of kindness grew stronger. The boys visited often, sometimes to mow again, sometimes just to sit on her porch with lemonade and talk. They told her about their dreams, about school, about the little triumphs and troubles of their young lives. In their company, she found a renewed sense of purpose, as though she were once again a grandmother, a guide, a listener whose presence mattered. The neighbors, too, continued to check in, waving as they passed, stopping to share news or offer small favors. The street no longer felt like a place she endured. It felt like home again. Martha herself began to change. She still moved slowly, still leaned heavily on her cane, but her spirit carried her with a lightness she had not known in years. She found herself humming as she worked in the kitchen, smiling at the sound of birds in the morning, even daring to plant a few flowers in the bed the boys had cleared. Each small act was a reclaiming of life, a refusal to let despair rule her. She knew her body would continue to weaken, that age was not something she could reverse. But she also knew that she was not powerless, not forgotten, not alone. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the boys prepared to leave after another visit, Martha asked them to wait. She disappeared inside and returned with an old album, its leather cover cracked but still intact. She opened it on the porch table, and the boys leaned in eagerly as she showed them photographs. Her and Henry in their youth, smiling on the very porch where they now sat. Her children as toddlers, barefoot in the grass. Family gatherings that filled the yard with faces and joy. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but not from sorrow. Instead, it was the weight of memory, now shared with new listeners who carried none of the past burdens but all of its lessons forward. As the boys flipped through the pages with reverence, Martha realized something profound. Life did not end when strength left the body. It did not end when children moved away, when a spouse passed on, when the world seemed indifferent. Life continued wherever kindness lived, wherever hands reached out to help, wherever laughter rose into the evening air. She had thought herself forgotten, but she had been wrong. She had been waiting, perhaps, for the right moment, the right people, to remind her that she was still part of a larger story. That night, she sat alone again on the porch, but the loneliness that had once suffocated her was gone. She looked out over the yard, neat and cared for, and up at the sky where the stars began to appear. She whispered a prayer of thanks for the boys, for her neighbors, for Henry's memory that still guided her, and for the strength to endure until help had come. She understood now that to live was not simply to survive, but to connect, to give and to receive, to let love in when it appeared at the door unannounced. Martha's life would never again be what it once had been, and she did not wish it to be. The weight of loneliness had taught her the depth of despair, but it had also carved out space for the joy she now felt. Her days ahead would still carry hardship, but also companionship. That made all the difference. As the night deepened and the crickets sang, she rocked gently in her chair, her heart lighter than it had been in many years, and allowed herself to believe in the goodness of people once more. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable real-life stories like this one. Click on the screen now to watch the next shocking video that will leave you speechless, and dive into our other must-see stories packed with twists you won't believe. And share this video with your friends and family, because this is one story everyone needs to see.